I was standing in our kitchen making morning coffee when the phone rang at 6 a.m., and the voice on the other end told me that my mother-in-law had been kidnapped. The ransom, the voice said, was $15 million. Not around 10, not a vague demand, but exactly 15, which happened to be the precise figure that had landed in my inheritance account less than 24 hours earlier, a number I had whispered to my husband Jason over candlelight the evening before. A number that no one else on the face of this earth should have known. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar morning sound behind me, filling the kitchen with the warm, unremarkable smell of a Tuesday, and I stood on the cold tile in bare feet with my knuckles white around my phone, while a man with a voice like broken asphalt told me that Eleanor Whitmore, my mother-in-law, collector of ceramic owls, baker of endless lemon cakes, the woman who had once spent 45 minutes explaining the correct way to fold a dinner napkin, was being held at an undisclosed location, and that if I involved the police, I would never see her again. The steam from my untouched mug curled toward the ceiling and dissolved into nothing. I had known about the money for exactly 19 hours. To understand how we arrived at that Tuesday morning, I need to take you back through the life I had built so carefully, so deliberately, over nearly a decade. Jason and I met at a fundraising gala for a children's literacy nonprofit. He had been volunteering. I had been representing the law firm where I worked as an associate. He spilled red wine on my white blouse and spent the next 3 events trying to make it up to me, until somewhere around the 4th, I stopped wanting him to stop trying. We married 4 years later in a small ceremony on the coast of Maine, surrounded by maple trees just beginning to turn gold and amber. I wore my grandmother Vera's pearl earrings. Jason cried at the altar, quietly, the way men cry when they are not yet aware they are crying. And I remember thinking that this particular moment, the ocean wind pulling at my veil, the man I loved blinking fast in the afternoon light, was the most certain I had ever felt about anything in my life. We bought our house 2 years into the marriage, a pale yellow colonial on a quiet street in the kind of neighborhood where people still walked their dogs at dusk and waved from across the lawn. We painted the front door navy blue on a Saturday in October, both of us splattered with paint and laughing, the whole street smelling of fallen leaves and that specific sharpness of autumn air before the first frost. Inside, we had built something that felt like permanence, a kitchen with tall windows that caught the morning light, a study lined with books we argued warmly about, a back porch where we drank wine on summer evenings and talked about everything and nothing. We disagreed about money sometimes, about time, about how often we visited his mother, but these were the ordinary frictions of 2 people learning to share a life, and we always found our way back to each other before the lights went out. I want to be precise about Eleanor, because it would be easy, from where I am standing now, to paint her as a monster from the very beginning. But the truth is more complicated, and in some ways more painful than that. When Jason first introduced us, she was, or appeared to be, a woman of considerable charm. She was in her early 60s, slender and upright, with silver hair she wore in an elegant chignon, and a way of entering a room that suggested she had already assessed it and found it slightly lacking. She served lemon cake at every gathering. She was known for it, in the way certain women are defined entirely by one domestic gift. And she had a dry, precise sense of humor I genuinely appreciated in those early years. She called me darling, and once told me I was not what she'd expected, which was quite a pleasant surprise. I took it as a compliment. Looking back, I should have paid closer attention to what I was not expected to be, and why that would have been preferable. The small corrections came gradually. Never aggressive, always framed as helpfulness. The way she asked about money, not bluntly, but with the practiced indirectness of someone who has spent decades extracting information while appearing to offer warmth. "That's a beautiful coat, Clara. Is that new? Business must be good." The way she addressed Jason as though I were a piece of furniture in conversations that began ostensibly as family discussions. The precise adjustments she offered on how I cooked, how I arranged things, how I dressed for holidays. "I've just always thought she'd want to know," she would tell Jason afterward, and Jason would squeeze my hand under the table in the wordless marital language that meant, "I see it, I know, please just let it pass." I did. For 8 years, I let things pass. I was the diplomat of our household, and I was very good at my job. And I did not understand until much later that sometimes the person who keeps the peace is also the person who pays for it. My grandmother Vera died in November, on a gray morning that smelled of wood smoke and the particular stillness that arrives just before winter settles in for good. She was 89 years old, sharp as a blade until the end, entirely unbothered by what other people thought of her choices. She had built her own business in the 1970s, a small chain of textile shops she'd started with $300 and an uncanny instinct for what people wanted before they knew they wanted it, and sold it in the early 2000s for considerably more than anyone had predicted. She had lived carefully since then, not extravagantly, and had watched her money grow with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has earned the right to be proud. She left everything to me. Not to my parents, who were comfortable enough, not to my cousins, with whom she'd had various falling outs that she cataloged with great precision and no apparent regret. To me, $15.3 million, a small lake house in Vermont that smelled of pine and old wool blankets, and her pearl earrings, which her attorney told me she had specified, in a handwritten addendum, I should wear to whatever came next. I didn't tell Jason immediately. That sounds calculated, but it wasn't. I needed to sit with the weight of it myself first, to walk through Vera's house one last time and understand what I was inheriting beyond the number. I spent 2 weeks in a kind of quiet astonishment, working through the estate process, sitting with her attorneys, standing in her kitchen remembering all the mornings I had watched her make tea, with the focused ceremony of someone who considered small rituals important. When the funds finally cleared, I made Jason's favorite dinner, roast chicken with lemon and herbs, the whole house filling with the smell of it, poured 2 glasses of wine, and told him across our kitchen table what my grandmother had left me. He was silent for a long moment. His wine glass was halfway to his mouth and stayed there. $15 million, he said finally. 15.3. He set the glass down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely name, something complex moving behind his eyes, a mixture of emotions I cataloged as surprise, love, and something else I didn't pause long enough to identify. "Clara," he said, "that's extraordinary. Vera was extraordinary." "She was," I agreed. We talked for a long time that night about what it meant, paying off the house, investing wisely, whether I could finally leave the law firm and do the work I actually wanted to do, rather than the work that paid well. It was a good conversation, honest and warm, and full of the particular hopefulness that belongs to people who believe their lives are about to improve. When we finally went to bed, I fell asleep with my head on Jason's shoulder, listening to the rain begin against the window, feeling, for the first time in months, like the ground beneath me was solid. I did not know that at 11:47 p.m., while I was sleeping, Jason sent a text message to his mother. 3 words and a number. "Call me tomorrow." 15.3. I didn't know that yet. The ransom call came at exactly 6:04 a.m. I've told you about the coffee and the cold tile and the steam from the untouched mug. What I haven't told you is that for the first 4 seconds after the man spoke, I felt nothing at all. A white, buzzing blankness, the way the mind protects itself from information it cannot immediately process. And then the number came, 15 million, the exact figure, shared with one person less than 9 hours ago. The man on the line had a prepared script. I understand that now. He was smooth and measured, neither theatrical nor robotic, just firm in the way someone sounds when they have done something like this before and found that calm efficiency produces better results than aggression. He told me Eleanor had been taken from her home in the early hours. He told me she was unharmed, for now. He gave me a 24-hour window for the wire transfer, a spoofed callback number, and strict instructions against contacting law enforcement. And then, before he ended the call, he said, "Mrs. Whitmore asked me to tell you she knows you'll do the right thing. She said, and I'm quoting, 'Clara always does what's right for the family.'" I stood very still after the call ended. It was not fear I felt. It was something colder and more precise than fear. Because Eleanor had never, not once in 8 years, described me as someone who did what was right for the family. That was her phrase, her self-description. The language Eleanor Whitmore used about Eleanor Whitmore. I called her immediately. She picked up on the second ring. "Clara!" Warm, bright, performed. "Good morning, darling. You're up early." In the background, I could hear a kettle. She was home. She had always been home. "Someone called me," I said carefully. "They said you'd been kidnapped." A pause. Barely a second, but I caught it. A fractional hesitation where there should have been none. "That's absurd, Clara. I'm in my dressing gown. It must have been a scam. Those calls use people's names from social media. You know how it is." She paused. "They knew the amount," I said, "of my inheritance." The silence this time was longer. "Well," she said, and her voice had shifted by some unmistakable degree, still warm but threaded now with something watchful, something prepared. "Why don't you come over for coffee this morning? I've just baked. I have that lemon cake." I said I would think about it. I hung up. And then I went to Jason's study, sat down at his desk, and opened his laptop. The message thread with Eleanor was at the top. The most recent exchange, sent at 11:47 p.m. the night before. "Call me tomorrow, 15.3. And above it, sent at 10:03 p.m. while I had been in the bathroom getting ready for bed. She just told me. Everything goes to her. Grandmother's whole estate. I don't know what this means for us. And Eleanor's reply at 10:17. "It means she'll never need you. Come see me tomorrow morning before she wakes up. We need to talk about what we do next." I read the messages 3 times. My hands were perfectly steady, which I found strange, because inside my chest something was collapsing. The slow, structural failure of a building you had believed was solid. I scrolled back further. 3 months ago. She mentioned the Vermont house again. Did you find out if Vera updated the will? 2 months ago. I spoke with Richard. He says if we can get a power of attorney before the estate closes, we have options. And Jason's reply? "Who is Richard?" And Eleanor, "Old friend, estate law. Don't worry about it. Just work on her. Work on her." I set the laptop down with great care. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead against the cold glass and looked at the oak tree Jason had planted the spring after we moved in. The leaves were almost gone. The morning light came through silver and exact, clarifying everything. I thought, something has always been wrong here. I just couldn't see it. I heard him on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway in his pajamas, hair disordered from sleep, and for one unguarded second, he looked entirely like the man I had married, soft around the eyes, warm, slightly rumpled in a way that had always made me feel tender. And then he saw the open laptop on the desk, and the expression shifted, and in that shift, I saw something I had never seen before on his face. Not guilt only, calculation. A man running quickly through his options. "Clara," he said. "Hey, you're up early." "Someone called at 6, I said. My voice was quiet, steady. I was surprised by my own steadiness. "They said your mother had been kidnapped. $15 million ransom." I watched his face. "So I called her. She was home, making tea." I let a beat of silence pass. "Then I read your messages." The room went absolutely still. Outside, the oak tree stood motionless in the gray morning air, and Jason stood in the doorway and said nothing, which was itself an answer, the loudest thing he had ever said to me in 8 years of marriage. "Jason," my voice had not risen. I did not need it to. "Who is Richard?" He said nothing for 3 full seconds. I counted them. The refrigerator hummed behind me, indifferent and ordinary, and somewhere outside, a car pulled slowly out of a driveway, tires on wet pavement, and Jason Whitmore, my husband of 6 years, the man who had cried at our altar, stood in the doorway of his own study and said nothing at all. "I asked you a question," I said. "Who is Richard?" "Clara." He took a step into the room. His hands came up in the small, appeasing gesture I had seen him make 100 times with his mother, with difficult clients at work, with anyone whose anger needed managing. And it always worked on me before. It did not work on me now. "I can explain. I know you can," I said. "I'm asking you to." He sat down in the chair across from the desk, and for a moment he pressed both hands flat against his thighs and stared at the floor. The morning light came through the window and lit the right side of his face and left the left in shadow, and I remember thinking, with the strange, dissociated clarity of someone in shock, that I had never noticed before how much older he looked in natural light. He was 41 years old, and he looked it, this morning, in a way he hadn't looked it last night over candlelight and good wine and the news of $15 million. "Richard Payne," he said finally. "He's an estate attorney. He went to school with my mother. She reached out to him a few months ago when—" He stopped. "When what?" "When she found out your grandmother was in declining health." The words came out carefully, paced, like someone walking across ice they know is thin. She wanted to understand if there were legal avenues, if the estate had certain structures that could be adjusted. "Adjusted," I repeated. He looked up at me. His eyes were red at the rims, which I noted and filed away, because I knew now the difference between real distress and the distress of someone who has been caught. She thought if we could get a power of attorney, a limited one, just for estate management purposes, before everything was finalized. She wanted access to my grandmother's estate, I said. She thought— He stopped again, started over. "My mother has been in a difficult position financially. You know that. The house is mortgaged, the retirement account isn't. I know her financial situation, Jason. I've known it for years. What I didn't know was that you were sharing information about my family's estate with her attorney." I stood. I did not move toward him. I simply stood, which somehow, I could see, frightened him more than any raised voice would have. I also didn't know that the ransom demand this morning was for exactly $15 million, which is exactly the number I told you last night, which you texted to your mother at 11:47 p.m. I watched his face. The color had left it in a slow, visible recession, like a tide going out. "Who made that call, Jason?" He closed his eyes. "I don't know." That is the wrong answer. "I swear to you, I didn't know she was going to—" He pressed a fist against his mouth. "She told me she wanted to have a conversation with you, about the money, about what it would mean for the family. I didn't know she was going to set up a—" He seemed unable to name it, as though the word scam or the word extortion would make it real in a way he was not yet prepared to face. "Your mother staged her own kidnapping," I said, "to extort $15 million from me, using information she received from you less than 12 hours after I shared it in confidence." I heard my own voice as if from a slight distance, level and almost gentle, the tone of someone explaining something to a person who has not yet grasped it. That is wire fraud, Jason. That is extortion. Those are federal crimes. He stood up from the chair so quickly it scraped against the wood floor. "Clara, you're not going to—" "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't tell me what I'm going to do." The silence between us was absolute. I picked up my phone from the desk. I walked past him, out of the study, into the kitchen, where my coffee was cold and the morning light had brightened on the pale yellow walls, and I sat down at the kitchen table and called my attorney. Her name was Diane Archer, and she was the most formidable woman I had ever met in a professional setting. A trim, precise woman in her late 50s who had spent 30 years in civil and criminal law and had a reputation for, as she once put it, not suffering anyone's nonsense at any volume. I had worked alongside her years ago at the firm, and when I left, she had pressed her card into my hand and said, "If you ever need the other kind of help, you know where I am." I had kept the card in my wallet for 4 years without understanding why. I understood now. She picked up on the third ring, which told me she was already in the office, and I told her in a calm and consecutive order exactly what had happened, starting from the moment the money cleared and ending with Jason in the doorway of his study saying, "I don't know." She was quiet for 15 seconds, a Diane Archer silence, which I knew meant she was not being still, she was building something. Then she said, "Forward me the text thread. Don't delete anything. Don't move anything. Do you have the incoming call logged from this morning?" I did. "Good. I'm going to make some calls. Don't speak to Eleanor Whitmore. Don't speak to anyone named Richard Payne. And Clara," a pause, "stay in your house." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. Jason had come to stand in the kitchen doorway and then retreated without speaking, and then returned, and I watched him move through the morning like a man who had misplaced something essential and could not remember where he last had it. He made coffee he didn't drink. He stood at the window looking at the yard. He said my name twice. Both times I didn't answer. Around 9 o'clock, his phone rang, and I watched his face when he looked at the screen, and I saw that it was his mother, and I watched him answer it and walk quickly to the far end of the room and turn his back to me and speak in a low, fast voice. I picked up my own phone, went to the recordings app, and pressed record. It is a single-party consent state. I had practiced law for 10 years. I knew exactly what I was doing. What I heard in the fragments that drifted back across the kitchen, she already called someone, and it wasn't supposed to, and "Mom, just stop talking," told me most of what I needed to know. But it was the end of the call that told me the rest. He turned back around, and his face had collapsed in a way that was almost painful to look at, and he said, "She's coming over." Then, after a long pause, "She says she can explain." "Let her come," I said. Eleanor arrived at 10:45. She was dressed with her usual precision, a cream blouse, gray wool trousers, her silver hair immaculate. But her mouth was very tight at the corners, and her movements, as she came through the front door Jason held open for her, had the quality of someone performing composure rather than possessing it. She smelled of her usual perfume, something expensive and aggressively floral, and it filled the hallway the way it always did, announcing her. And under ordinary circumstances, I would have noticed it and said nothing. Under these circumstances, I noticed it and filed it away along with everything else. The way she air-kissed near my cheek and took my hands and held them in the greeting she had used for 8 years, equal parts warmth and ownership. "Clara, darling, I'm so glad we're doing this," as though it had been arranged for her convenience. I said nothing. I led her to the living room. I sat in the armchair, not the sofa, where she would have sat beside me, close enough to touch, close enough to manage. The armchair placed the coffee table between us and allowed me to watch her face in full light. She sat on the sofa. Jason sat beside her, slightly behind, like a man taking shelter in someone else's shade. "I know what you think happened," Eleanor began. "Tell me what you think, I said. She took a breath, a deliberate, settling breath, the kind designed to communicate patience with unreasonable people, and folded her hands in her lap. "That phone call this morning was a misunderstanding. I had spoken with a friend who works in security consulting about the estate settlement, and there was a miscommunication about what sort of outreach was appropriate. It should never have— Your security consultant friend called me at 6 a.m., I said, quoted my inheritance amount to the dollar, and used a phrase that you specifically use about yourself. Clara always does what's right for the family. I kept my voice entirely even. That is not a miscommunication, Eleanor. That is a script. She held my gaze. For just 1 second, the performance flickered, a tightening at the corners of her eyes, something cold and calculating surfacing through the warmth. And then she reset, smooth and certain. You're upset. That's completely understandable. But I think if we can sit down and look at the broader situation, what broader situation? She paused. Then, carefully, your grandmother's estate is very large. You're going to be managing it alone, without experience in that kind of financial structure. Richard, who is simply an old friend with expertise, was trying to help ensure that family interests were considered. Jason and I have both invested enormously in this marriage, in this house, in your future together, and it seemed, I said softly, that $15 million was easier to access before I had a lawyer of my own. The room went quiet. Eleanor Whitmore looked at me with something I had never seen on her face directed at me before. Not warmth, fabricated or otherwise, something stripped and direct and wholly unpleasant. Her hands, still folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. I've given this family everything, she said. Her voice had changed, the softness gone, something harder and flatter beneath it. My son, my time, my resources. When he married you, I thought I was generous, I was welcoming. And now you're sitting here threatening me over a phone call. I'm not threatening you, I said. I'm informing you. My attorney is currently reviewing the text messages between you and Jason regarding my grandmother's estate, the call logs from this morning, and anything on record regarding Richard Payne's recent professional activities. If it turns out that a coordinated extortion attempt was made using interstate phone communication, that is a matter for federal law enforcement, not a family conversation. I stood. You're welcome to stay for coffee if you'd like. I'll be in my study. I walked out of the room. My hands were perfectly steady. My heart was moving at approximately twice its normal speed. In the hallway, I passed the framed photograph from our wedding. Jason's face turned toward mine, both of us caught mid-laugh in that golden afternoon light, and I did not stop to look at it. But I was aware of it, the way you are aware of something beginning its last moments of existing unchanged. What happened over the following 72 hours moved with a speed that surprised even Diane. It turned out that Richard Payne had not been careful. A man in his late 60s who had been practicing estate law for 4 decades in a small city had grown accustomed to a level of professional invisibility, his name not searchable, his moves not scrutinized, and had not adjusted his behavior to account for a client whose daughter-in-law had spent 10 years in law firms and knew exactly what to look for. The emails between Payne and Eleanor, subpoenaed within 48 hours, were remarkable in their specificity. A 6-month plan, documented in careful stages, beginning with an attempt to convince Jason to have me sign a general power of attorney for estate planning purposes. Forged, if necessary, Payne had written, though I'd prefer we avoid that if the husband can be persuasive. And culminating, if all else failed, in the phone call scheme, designed to panic a newly wealthy woman into a wire transfer before she had consulted anyone. The number 15 million had been discussed in the emails 3 weeks before Vera died, based on a rough estimate of the estate's value. When Jason's text confirmed the exact figure, Payne had made the call himself from a burner phone purchased with cash in a town 40 miles away. He had been thorough. He had not been thorough enough. Jason came to me on the second evening while I was working at the kitchen table with a stack of Diane's documents spread across the wood. He sat across from me and waited until I looked up, and then he said, I didn't know he was going to make the call. His voice was quiet and raw, stripped of its usual smoothness. I knew there was a plan, about the money, about getting access. I thought it was a legal strategy. I didn't ask enough questions because I didn't want to know the answers. He paused. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. Another pause. I'm sorry, Clara. I don't know if that means anything to you right now. I looked at him for a long time. This man who had cried at our altar, who had planted the oak tree in the backyard, who had also texted his mother at 11:47 p.m. with a number that was not his to share. It means something, I said. I'm not sure yet what. He nodded. He did not push for more, which was the first wise decision he had made in some time. Eleanor Whitmore and Richard Payne were charged under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, federal wire fraud, as well as conspiracy under 18 U.S.C. Section 1349. The FBI became involved within a week of Diane's initial filings. Once federal investigators examined Payne's records, they found 2 prior instances of similar schemes involving elderly estate clients, neither of which had resulted in charges. Eleanor was arrested on a Tuesday morning, precisely 1 week after the ransom call, and walked out of her cream colonial in handcuffs, while a neighbor who had been watering her front lawn stood frozen on her porch and stared. I was not there to see it. I did not need to be. Diane sent me the arrest report. I read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, hot this time, and I found I felt almost nothing except a quiet, settled clarity. The feeling of a weight you have been carrying so long you forgot it was not part of you lifting away. Jason was not charged. The investigation determined that while he had shared information and been aware of the broad outline of his mother's intentions, there was insufficient evidence that he had knowingly participated in the specific scheme. He cooperated fully, which Diane said helped. The marriage did not survive it. That is not a sad sentence precisely, just a true one. We sold the yellow house in February, divided everything with clean and functional fairness, and parted without the performance of hatred that I had feared, and that, in the end, neither of us had the appetite for. He moved to Boston. I stayed in state. I am writing this from the lake house in Vermont. It is early April, and the ice on the lake has just broken. You can hear it in the mornings. A series of low cracks and sighs, the frozen surface releasing itself back to water. The pines along the shore are still and dark and smell exactly as they smelled when I was a child, visiting Vera here, sitting in the kitchen while she made tea with the same slow ceremony. I have been here for 6 weeks. I have refurnished slowly, carefully, choosing things that feel like choices rather than compromises. There is a desk by the window that looks out over the water, and on it there are papers I am drafting for the foundation I am establishing in Vera's name, a literacy fund, because she believed, more than almost anything else, that access to language was access to power. I am wearing her pearl earrings. I wear them most days now, not for occasions, but simply because they are mine, and because she wanted me to understand that what comes next is always worth dressing for. Eleanor Whitmore pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud in the federal proceedings. Under the terms of the plea agreement, she received 3 years probation and was ordered to pay restitution, not to me, since no money had actually transferred, but to the 2 prior victims Payne's files had identified. Richard Payne received 18 months in a federal facility and will likely serve 12. His law license is gone. His practice is gone. Everything he spent 40 years building turned out to have a single weight-bearing wall, and it has now been removed. I do not spend much time thinking about either of them, because they have become very small in the landscape of my days. The oak tree is still standing on the lawn of the yellow house. The new owners kept it. I asked, in the final walkthrough, whether they planned to, and the woman who bought the house looked surprised and said, "Of course, it's beautiful." It is. Jason planted it in April, the first spring after we moved in, and it was barely taller than my shoulder. And now it is enormous and old-looking, rooted so deep that no winter has managed to dislodge it. I said goodbye to it on the last day. That is not something I am embarrassed about. It was a good tree, and it had nothing to do with anything that went wrong. On the desk beside my papers, there is a photograph of Vera. She is in her garden, maybe 70 years old, standing with a trowel in her hand and squinting slightly against the sun, and she looks exactly like herself, unbothered and precise and entirely aware of what she is worth. I look at it sometimes when the work gets complicated, or when the paperwork piles up, or when I am tired in ways that are not about sleep. She left me $15 million and a lake house and a pair of pearl earrings. But what she also left me, what I only fully understood in the weeks after that Tuesday morning, was the knowledge that she had always believed I was the one in the family worth leaving it to. Not because I was the most trusting, or the most forgiving, or the best at keeping peace. Because I was the one who, when it mattered, would know what to do with it. She was right. I always am.